Okay, here is our third podcast for Standard 1.1, which is all about organic molecules. So far we've talked about carbohydrates and lipids. Now we're going to take a look at proteins and nucleic acids. So starting with proteins, proteins have various functions within the human body and for living things. Lots of different things that they can do. For instance, they can serve as structural proteins in living things, so they make up your muscles. They are basically what we see when we look at you, your blue eyes, your skin color, hair color, all of those things are determined by proteins. Okay, they can act as enzymes, which are going to speed up chemical reactions, like the process of digesting your food. Without enzymes, it would take a very, very long time to digest your food, but with enzymes, you can digest a meal in less than 24 hours. Some act as antibodies, which are going to fight diseases. So these are special proteins that white blood cells will make in your body. And when things get in there that shouldn't be there, bacteria and viruses, antibodies will go over and fight them for you. Okay. You also have some proteins that will transport things around the body. Hemoglobin is an example of this. Hemoglobin is found on your red blood cells and will carry oxygen around in the blood. You also have proteins that are going to help the cell membrane pass things in and out. So remember we talked about the cell membrane, that's its job is to let things in and out because of the phospholipids. Sometimes it needs help with that, and so there are special proteins that will help. Now, proteins are an expression of our genes. So the genes are what determine what you look like. The proteins that get made actually give us the traits that you see. Okay. Proteins are made up of monomers called amino acids, and there are 20 different types of amino acids. And all amino acids have the same basic structure, but they are different in one part of them, and that is called the R group. So the R group is this little part here that's highlighted in blue. So all amino acids have the same basic structure, and if you look here, you can see there's hydrogen, nitrogen, carbon and oxygen in all of them. But then sometimes, like down here, cysteine has sulfur in it. Okay, so this R group has sulfur. So when we look at proteins and talk about amino acid structures, amino acids have two basic groups to them. There's the amino group, which is the part that has the nitrogen. And then there is the carboxyl group, which is the carbon with two oxygens coming off of it. And then at the middle, you have a central carbon. And off that central carbon, you always have a hydrogen. And then the thing that is different between the 20 of them is the R group. So the rest of it is called the R group, and the R stands for remainder of the molecule. So it's the R group that varies from one amino acid to the next. So there's 20 different R groups making up the 20 different amino acids. So when you're going to make a protein, you actually make a special type of covalent bond called a peptide bond. And you take the amino acids, which are the monomers of a protein, and you link them together, and you make polypeptides. So remember, the monomer is a single unit, and then you put lots of them together, you get the polymer, so the polypeptide. And this happens by dehydration synthesis. Okay, so here we're going to look at how a protein will be assembled. So remember, here is our amino acid structure. So we have our amino group and our carboxyl group, and there's that side group, the R group, that's a little bit different. So we're going to use this box as our symbol for the amino acid, and if we're going to assemble a protein, it happens by simple dehydration synthesis. And remember, every time that one amino acid goes to another, water gets released. And so these are all different kinds of amino acids that make up this particular protein called oxytocin. We can look at a second protein, which is actually very similar to oxytocin. And again, it's put together the same way, dehydration synthesis, the water comes out. Okay, this is a protein called the antidiuretic hormone. And in here, you can see that there are two amino acids that are different between these two proteins. And it's those two amino acids that make them do very different jobs. Oxytocin is actually involved with pregnancy and with the production of milk. And antidiuretic hormone is actually involved with your body's ability to retain water and the way that your kidneys function. So these two little amino acids that are different in them give them very different functions. All right, now not only do we have the level of protein that we just looked at, which is just the sequence of amino acids, there's actually 4 different levels to how proteins get organized. So the first is the primary structure, and that's what we just looked at, the amino acid sequence. Proteins typically are at least 200 amino acids long, And the sequence of the amino acids is determined by your DNA sequence. Now, the secondary structure are the basic forms that the amino acid chain will fold into. So you get this long chain of amino acids like you just saw in the animation, but then they will actually fold up into different forms. Sometimes they'll form a helix, which is like a spiral staircase, or they will fold into like a sheet, almost like a fan. The tertiary structure is how now the entire protein is going to fold on itself. So you don't have these big long chains of amino acids. They actually fold up into very small, compact little forms. And then the quaternary structure will happen when some proteins are made up of more than one polypeptide chain. And so the different polypeptides come together and make the complex protein that you have. So let's take a look at this. So your primary structure is simply the amino acid chain, big long chain. Secondary structure is that certain parts of that chain will fold up on itself, so there's the sheet, or they can spiral on themselves, there's the helix. And then the rest of the protein will all kind of fold up within. And then sometimes you get other polypeptide chains involved in there. So there's the original one, but there's two others also involved with making this protein, and those are your 4 levels. Okay, here's a look at the levels of organization that we're talking about with proteins. So the primary structure is the specific order of amino acids that you will see that is coded by your DNA. The first thing that a protein is going to do is it's going to fold into the secondary structure. So in the secondary structure, we're going to get some specific types of shapes like the alpha helix and the pleated sheets here. And then from there, the protein is going to continue to fold in on itself in a very specific way, and it will take on a very specific shape. So you can see there's these kind of indents and stuff in here. So some proteins will stop here. They don't go any further. Others will add in another polypeptide, and you will get your quaternary structure. So here is a protein that has a quaternary structure. Hemoglobin is an example of one of these that is actually made up of 4 different polypeptide chains, but various peptide chains will come in and make a very complex structure for the protein, which will allow it to function the way it is supposed to. This is the last group of organic molecules, and your nucleic acids, their job is to store and transmit your genetic information. Nucleic acids are made of monomers called nucleotides, and all nucleotides have 3 parts to them. You have a phosphate group, you have a pentose sugar, so it's different than the carbohydrate sugars that we talked about, which have 6 carbons. The pentose sugar has only 5 carbons, so it's a 5-carbon sugar. And then hanging off of that is something called a nitrogen-containing base. So this is a base that obviously would have nitrogen in it. The C here stands for a particular kind of base called cytosine. So you have the phosphate group, you have the sugar, and then you have the nitrogen-containing bases. So all nucleotides are made up of these 3 parts. Okay, so large nucleotides, or large nucleic acids come together by connecting all the nucleotides together, and you get a polynucleotide. Examples of polynucleotides that you would know about would be DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, and RNA, or ribonucleic acid. Later in the year, we're going to go over some of the big differences between them. Their job is to store and transmit our genetic information, but there are some structural differences that happen, and you can see that in this table. But we will go into more detail with that later in the year. You also can see here that when you look at DNA, a lot of people will recognize this as the double helix. And the double helix means that you've got 2 strands, and they will wrap around each other, and they're held together by something called complementary base pairing, and that's kind of the classic picture that people think of when they think of DNA. So when you think of nucleic acids, you look at one single nucleotide right here, and you can think about the double helix of DNA. Another nucleotide that also functions in the body is ATP. ATP is our energy currency. Again, we're going to talk about this more in detail, but it's adenosine triphosphate, so the tri means 3. So instead of 1 phosphate group like there was on the regular nucleotides, these ones actually have 3. But they still have the 5-carbon sugar, and they still have the nitrogen-containing base. In this case, it's adenine. So the little bit difference here, and the energy is actually stored in the bonds between these last 2 phosphates. So if you take that phosphate off, you're going to release energy. Put it back on, you're going to store energy. All right, so through these 3 podcasts, we have talked about the 4 major groups of organic molecules. Okay, remember the word organic means contains carbon. Does not mean all natural, means contains carbon. The 4 groups that you will find in living things are carbohydrates. Remember, carbohydrates are used primarily for energy. Lipids, which are also an energy source, but they also make up cell membranes and steroids. Proteins, which have lots of different functions in the body. And nucleic acids, which are your DNA and RNA.